All right, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Everybody made it through all the weather and all of that. I'm very glad that our panel made it this afternoon. I'm Carrie Penman. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer and Senior Vice President of Advisory Services for NAVEX Global, and I'm very delighted to have this great team as part of the panel for this afternoon on the topic of the ROI of compliance, how to transform compliance into a competitive advantage. And I think we all know or describe this as the $64,000 question, right? How do you measure cost avoidance and all of the measuring of program effectiveness that we talk about over years and years and years, and we're looking for that holy grail. I do think that the panel today has put together some really terrific ideas, examples, has some stories to tell of ways that they approach the ROI in their own organizations. And so I'll just maybe start with some introductions of the panel. I'll start myself and then go down the line. As I mentioned, I'm Carrie Penman, and before I was at NAVEX, I was the first compliance ethics officer at Westinghouse Electric Corporation in Pittsburgh. That was in the 90s. That's when Westinghouse still existed. After I left Westinghouse, I became the Deputy Director of the Ethics and Compliance Officer Association, and now have been with NAVEX and our predecessor company since 2003. So, Jeff, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Gary. I'm Jeff Eglash. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer at Nokia. I've been there for about a year now. Previously, I was at General Electric, where I was Executive Litigation Counsel handling litigation, investigations, and compliance. Before that, I was a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, the Inspector General for the Los Angeles Police Department, and then for a brief period of time, a partner at a now-defunct global law firm.
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lynn Holland. I've moved the mic away a little bit because I feel like I'm very loud, naturally. I am SVP, Deputy General Counsel, and Global Chief Compliance and Ethics Officer for PepsiCo. And thanks to some PepsiCo employees who are there for coming.
Cheering section.
If I embarrass myself, please don't tell anyone. I've been there also about a year, so I'm going on 13 months or so. Prior to that, okay. Is that good? Loud enough? Prior to that, I said I was at PepsiCo for about a year, 13 months. Prior to that, I was a federal prosecutor as well. I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Virginia, in Alexandria, Virginia, and also in Washington, D.C. for the prior 13 years. And I ended up for the past few years as the deputy chief of the National Security and International Crime Unit. So I was specializing in counterterrorism, counterespionage, sanctions, international drug trafficking, those kinds of cases.
We're not messing with this group.
Hi, I'm Melissa Nandy, and I have never had a badge, so I feel much less cool than my fellow panelists. I am a Chief Compliance Officer at Rockwell Automation. I also am Vice President of Law, and I manage litigation, environmental health and safety, and product safety for the company. I've been with Rockwell almost 11 years, and before that I was with the law firm Jones Day and did litigation there as well as government investigation work. And I'm happy to be here, badge or no badge.
Great. All right. Thank you. So obviously the key topic is ROI of compliance, and we're going to have a conversation today about how each of these organizations does demonstrate the value of compliance, the ROI of compliance within their organizations and across their organizations, so including with their leadership teams, middle managers, and so on and so forth. And so I thought that I would start by just asking each one of our panelists to take a little bit of time to talk about their programs and to really better establish a baseline for the purposes of the discussion today. What does return look like for you at your company? And Lynn, I thought I'd start with you.
Sure, thank you so much. The way that I had thought about this was, first of all, to just break it out into a couple of different buckets. At PepsiCo, we've taken the DOJ and SEC guidance of the hallmarks of an effective compliance program, and we've kind of broken them out into 10 different areas for ourselves, but they go into the buckets, if you will, of promote, monitor, and enforce. But for the ROI specifically, I would think about it in a broader sense, which is that, number one, there are competitive advantages of a good compliance program, and those have to do with some of those macro features, macro advantages, such as employee retention, stock price, which I believe was mentioned last night, right? Melissa was saying, or this morning. Recruitment, getting the top talent, and so forth. Performing productivity for the company itself. Investor confidence, consumer confidence, customer confidence, those types of things. The second bucket for me, if you will, is risk mitigation, and that has to do with how you stop misconduct and save the company money by preventing and stopping fraud and theft and so on. And I can give some examples. Obviously, that's part of what we all do with our investigations and risk mitigation. Also, of course, there would be for risk under the risk mitigation bucket. Of course, would also be the training, awareness, messaging, your hotline, all of those kinds of things as well. And then the third bucket for me was business improvements or efficiencies or insights. And like a lot of you, I'm sure at PepsiCo, the compliance and ethics group, we keep a lot of the statistics. So not only how many speak-up calls, but how many HR referrals, how many environmental health and safety referrals, how many we work with the customer complaints group, right, and we refer them things from the speak-up line. We also work a lot on trying to make procedures and processes in the company more efficient if we can, and I have some examples for you there. And then the last bucket, at least the way, again, that I was thinking about this, was really related to follow-up. So in terms of discipline, remediation, and ongoing risk assessment. So, of course, risk assessment was part of my second bucket of risk mitigation. But I thought of the ongoing obligations, and, of course, the DOJ guidance has, as you know, sort of following up, ongoing monitoring and auditing of programs as one of their important elements that they look for. So those are the types of things. Those are kind of my four buckets, if you will.
Okay, great. Melissa?
I really want to expand on the first one that you mentioned, Lynn, and take a deep dive in that space. So at Rockwell Automation, we talk about how our integrity value helps us attract and retain the best employees, customers, partners, and shareholders. And so for employees, we know that this issue is important for our employees. And we always say attract and retain, because it's not just about bringing new employees in the door. It's about keeping the ones we have. And it's not just about millennials. We love to talk about millennials and how they all want a value match with their employers. I believe it's not a new concept. We've all wanted a value match with our employers. We've all wanted to work with companies with integrity. And I hear from 40-year veterans of Rockwell Automation that this is something they care about. This is something they're really proud of. And they've helped build this DNA, and they want it to continue. They're committed to it. And I hear from interns who come and are impressed that I took this business ethics class in school, and now I'm learning about what it's all about, right? And everywhere in between. So we know employees care about it, and I believe it's a differentiator for us in terms of recruitment and retention. For customers and partners, they're asking us questions, and we are a business-to-business company. We're industrial automation. Many of our customers and partners are companies like the ones in this room. So they are committed to these concepts as well. They want us to complete their sustainable supplier surveys, and they want us to show and demonstrate a commitment to these issues. And they push us, and we want to exceed their expectations. So that pushes us further. And just like that, we push our suppliers further. And, the rising tide lifts all boats, and I'm happy to be part of that conversation there. And then when it comes to shareholders, and Lynn mentioned the data, Tim, if you guys were at the dinner last night, Tim mentioned two numbers that were really impactful to me. One was 6.4, and that was the percentage of premium that world's most ethical companies get over the S&P 500 over the past several years. So if you remember the line graph, it's 6.4% premium. The other number that he mentioned, which I thought was kind of staggering, I hadn't heard it before, was 33%. And that's the increased investment that people are making in responsible investing. So last year, over the year before, there was 33% more investments going in the responsible investing category. So whether that's mutual funds or indices that are in the sustainability space, that's where people are putting their investment dollars. And whether they're chasing that increased premium of 6.4% or whatever it is, or whether they really truly are, putting their money where their socially consciousness is, we want to play in that space. We want to get those investment dollars. So we think those are the shareholders we want to attract. And really having a strong integrity value helps us do that.
Great, Jeff.
Well, I mean, I would echo what we just heard. I would say at Nokia, we already have a terrific compliance culture. It's a company that's been around well over 100 years. It's a Nordic company. They have that sort of Scandinavian inherent belief in people. They had a very thinly resourced compliance program, but really strong leadership, strong tone at the top, and few major compliance misses. However, they do have a pretty high risk profile from a compliance standpoint. We're selling major telecommunications infrastructure projects to governments and state-owned enterprises in tough parts of the world with heavy reliance on third-party networks. So from a compliance standpoint, the risk profile is high. And additionally, Nokia recently completed its acquisition of Alcatel-Lucent, which is a major French telecommunications company that, as you probably know, had its own significant corruption and compliance misses that resulted in prosecution and a compliance monitor and suspension and debarment issues and so forth. In my previous position at General Electric, I was responsible for the compliance integration of GE's acquisition of Alstom, a major French energy company that had one of the largest ever FCPA settlements. And so I spent about a year and a half working on the integration, and now I'm at Nokia, and I'm similarly working on an integration of a somewhat compliance-challenged or a company with a checkered history when it comes to compliance into a company that has a very strong compliance culture. And so I think one of the return on investment points that the leadership looks to me for is a seamless integration that takes two very different cultures and two very different companies and two very different programs and brings them into one harmonious program and culture, and results in the synergies and savings that are part of the underpinning for the rationale for the acquisition. At the same time, the two companies did build up different programs, largely because of their history. And when the Alcatel-Lucent business had its compliance monitor, they necessarily needed to build up a rather complex and somewhat bureaucratic set of policies and procedures to satisfy the various overseers and regulators that were looking to see what was built. And in large measure, the compliance program that was built up was one that sort of sat in a corner and said, yes, you can do this transaction, or no, you can't do this. And what I'm used to and what I'm trying to bring in terms of a new mindset is a notion of compliance as a strategic business partner that works hand in hand with the business leaders to meaningfully understand and address the compliance risks that are faced, manage those risks, and educate the leaders about what are and what are not acceptable risks that can be undertaken and how best to mitigate them. So I think that is ultimately the major selling point for what we can do, is changing that mindset of compliance from one being, you raise a red flag and you say, no, you can't do this, to one that enables the business leaders to accomplish their objectives, but in a way that properly manages the risks that we face.
Carrie, if I could just throw in one more point on that, if this resonates with anybody, one of the opportunities, or one of the things that we're trying to do also is inject ourselves a little bit earlier in the process, right? And one example of that, and I'm sure you've all heard of it or experienced it perhaps as well, is for an M&A type transaction. So we see that we are asked sometimes at the very end, hey, what do you think about this deal? Can you let me know by tomorrow? And, my answer is, if you need to know by tomorrow, the answer is no. If you could give me maybe about 2 weeks to study the documents, maybe we can come up with a reasonable analysis, right, of the risk. But the bigger point is, in terms of that first bucket in the competitive advantages, was that if compliance and ethics can be with the business leaders as they're negotiating the deal, for example, if you do find some difficult spot in that deal room, in that document room, then you can say to the business, look, how important is it that you go into X country or Y country? You might want to consider lopping that off the deal, right? You might not want to have that part of the business if you're going to, join forces with this potential partner. Or you might want to offer less if you're going to join with this potential partner, because it's going to cost you, a couple $1 million or more to go in and clean up whatever potential situation that you're seeing. So my point is that if you can be involved a little bit earlier, you might have a way to input and get the business folks to a better valuation of that.
And I think that's a great point, because when you come in at the last minute, that's how we can get the reputation of being the just say no police. And I think that it is very important to be embedded into the business operations. And there's one thing I want to come back to this document. I'm assuming you all have seen the latest document that came out of the U.S. Department of Justice that have the various questions on the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. But I just want to note that Section 11 was specifically on mergers and acquisitions and due diligence processes and what work was done as part of due diligence. And, that is an area, obviously, I think where a lot of organizations get in trouble is they make an acquisition and they have missed, as part of the due diligence, some of the potential failures. So I think you raise a great point. I want to come back to this document a little bit later. But I want to take the conversation maybe next to how do you get that buy-in, that engagement? How do you build that trust with the business leaders and help them to understand? We were telling some stories before the session, and we were talking about, how many of you have had a business leader say, Jeff is responsible for ethics and compliance at Nokia, right? Who is really responsible for ethics and compliance? Everyone, right? And so how do you make that mind shift, right? So I ask the panel, whoever would like to take that one first, but how do you build that and instill that different line of thinking?
Well, so I've started doing at Nokia one of the things that I thought was absolutely brilliant that we did at GE, and maybe many of your companies or all of your companies do them, but at Nokia we hadn't. And those are leader-led compliance operating reviews, which are periodic sessions where a business leader or a regional leader has to get up and in front of senior management say, this is my business or this is my region. These are the compliance risks that we face. Here's how I'm managing those risks. And that's the business leader talking. That's not the compliance leader. Now, certainly behind the scenes, the compliance leader is arming that leader to speak. But it just drives home the notion that business leader is the one that ultimately owns the risks and is ultimately going to be held accountable. And so it was the cornerstone, I believe, and the key to success for compliance at GE, and I'm making it the cornerstone of compliance at Nokia. We want to keep them informal. We want to keep them small. We don't want them to become these massive undertakings that take people away from their business. But nevertheless, if we can get members of the senior leadership team to sit down around a table and have that particular business unit leader have to articulate what the risks are that he or she is facing and how they're managing them, and that they understand that they're ultimately accountable for compliance misses, it has totally shifted, or it is totally shifting the attitude and driving a sense of business leaders owning compliance, which I think is the single most important thing that we can all hope to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think what you're also doing when you do that is you're teaching them the language of the compliance business.
We do something similar at Rockwell Automation. So we have compliance risk assessments on a regular basis by business unit and by function and by region. And the leader of that business unit, function, or region does a readout to our Business Standards Compliance Committee. So they own it and they own the remediation. We, of course, support it, or they maybe legal supports it. It can fall into multiple categories, but the leader owns it. And, of course, we support the effort that goes into the actual risk assessment. So in addition to showing who owns it, it also shows that leader how much support we can give to them and how much data we have access to in terms of hotline trend analysis, regulatory environment. We can really partner with them and be arm in arm with them in presenting to them what some of the risks are that we're seeing. And then we have a several-hour, half-day session with their leadership team where we show them some of what we're seeing. They come to the table with what they're seeing, and then we sort of talk through what the key risks are. So it shows them our value as well, and then ultimately they own it and they present it to our BSCC. So it's kind of a 2-for-1, if you will.
I think we're trying to do some of the same things, and I'm definitely going to try to steal Jeff's idea and bring it back to PepsiCo. So I think it's brilliant.
I stole it from GE, so you're.
But it does have to do with ownership, right? Seeding the culture. We talk a lot about seeding the compliance culture in the business, and not just being sort of the department sitting somewhere at headquarters or wherever it is in an ivory tower. But seeding the culture, ownership of the business units, anything that you can do to increase that. What I have found to be effective is to find ways to give back. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. 2 of them relate to our third-party due diligence program. We're rolling out various enhancements and improvements to it. And recently, one of our C&E officers was out in the AMENA area, and one of the business people said, I've been wanting to fire this vendor for a really long time, but now that you've done this program and I have this report, I now have the tool and I can get rid of them. But before there was just, I wasn't comfortable, there was noise, there was pushback, there was this, that, the other, but now you've given me a tool and now I can say you can blame it on headquarters if you want to, I don't care, right? But now you've got the ammunition to do that. Another one I was going to say is that we because we're very decentralized and fairly, large company, we didn't have a list of terminated vendors. So in each market, there are lots and lots of vendors still on the books, and some are current, some are not. So as part of our third-party due diligence, we're putting together the list of terminated vendors, whether they're just inactive or are they, do they have some kind of black mark on their reputation, either way. But they're now on this list, and the list is centrally accessible, and we carry it around, we email it, we give it out, it's a bit of and people are looking for those kinds of resources. So we try to be, in addition to the speak up data and those kinds of things where we see at particular locations where we're always reporting back and trying to be helpful with that stuff.
So I am hearing a little bit of a theme, and one of the points that we often talk about is, and we talked a little bit before the session about travel budgets, right? Nobody has a travel budget. But I think one of the most important things that I've heard from this group and from others is, to get out of our offices and to get into the field and to have those conversations. I remember the days when, I'd call a business unit leader and they'd pick up the phone. What did we do now, right? That's the challenge, is to have those conversations that are happening and helping business leaders to problem solve before you're calling with the what did we do now? We've had an issue raised. So do you guys have any other suggestions or tips for things that you do, on a fairly regular basis to get out with the business leaders, to start to build that bridge of how can we help you as opposed to how can we fire your best salesperson?
Well, one thing I'll raise, we talked about travel budgets earlier and how hard that is, but when you're going to be revealing some of these statistics, let's say it's ombudsman statistics or a trend to your board, and let's say there's some trending in China. It's one thing to say, hey, we have this spike, and here's what we think it is, and I'm just positing that from my office back in the Midwest in the United States. And it's another thing to tell the board, and you know what, I went there and I spent time there investigating, and I spent a day with the country manager and his management team, and actually an extended management team, and I went to branch meetings, and I personally did this work, and I'm telling you this is what's happening, and that's a good investment of my time and of the company's resources and of the travel budget that we have, much as it is. And that just gives, our work more credibility, I think, and they want to see it. They're not going to be looking at me like, I can't believe we spent that travel, right? So I think to the extent you have to fight to get some of that travel budget, that's the argument you have to make is, I want to be able to stand in front of the board and tell them what I did and that I laid eyes on it and that I'm not making these calls from my office in the United States. So that's one thing I'm doing to be more proactive.
Yeah, and I was going to say another thing is that if you are going to, as a compliance and ethics officer, present something to the board, it's usually a nice idea, right, to call the president or the general manager of that sector of that business to say, hey, listen, you did have some numbers going up in this location or that country, and talk to them about it before you go to the board because they may get questions, and then you are their ally. You are not saying, the internal affairs police, you should do this, you should do that. What you're saying is, hey, listen, these are the facts, these are the numbers. Let's talk through them and let's see if there's something how can I help you? How can we do, how are there any procedures we can help you with and so on? But you're arming them. You may get questions on this. You may get questions on that next time you see the CEO or the CFO or the, right?
And nobody likes to be blindsided, right?
Exactly.
So that's a perfect example.
Exactly.
So I was trying to think, preparing for this panel, of instances where you could really say compliance had a great win that just made the business leaders love you. And although the examples are few and far between, I actually had one recently that I just thought is a great example. And we had a business in let's say a notoriously difficult African nation when it comes to transparency, and there was a third party that the business had previously used that was just sort of blacklisted, and there were all sorts of problems and red flags, and that individual had then gone on to become our key customer point of contact at the largest telecom operator in this country. So they were not just a significant customer, but the most important customer for us in a major country. And when we learned that this person that we obviously couldn't do business with was in this key role, the business was ready to say, well, of course, compliance won't let us interact in any way with this customer. We're going to have to just basically write off this huge customer. And we looked at it carefully, and we were able to craft a set of protocols and mitigants and ways that we can do business and ways that we can meet with this person and the various protective measures that we could put in place that we felt safeguarded our interests but still enabled us to maintain the relationship with a critically important customer. And so that was a case where the business was to their credit, ready to say, sorry, we can't work with this company, and compliance came in and kind of saved the day. And they, for at least for a moment, they loved us.
Well, and I think, again, the common theme that's coming from this is, it's about building credibility, and it's about knowing the business, and to really become students of the business, right? I mean, it's important to understand what their challenges are, what their risks are, and the only way you really have a chance to do that is to spend time with them and with their leadership teams. And I guess from this group, I don't think we can say that enough. We can get caught up in our data and our charts and our training and all of the things that we have to do on a day-to-day basis, but to take that step back and say, where can we truly add value to the business? So you also mentioned the board. Are there other things that you do with regard to the board that helps them justify the resources and also perhaps know how to ask you all the right questions that helps to ensure the visibility of your program?
We have a very active board and a very active and supportive audit committee. They have their finger on the pulse. They have, one of the things I love is that when we have our periodic sort of update 4 times a year on compliance, at the end of the regular session, they kick everybody else out of the room, and then it's a one-on-one conversation between me and the audit committee members. And it's an opportunity for me to sort of say, okay, let me tell you the real story. Even though the leadership, the management of the company is so supportive that I never have anything to say in front of them that I wouldn't say in front of the management. But one of the things that I like to do is just remind them about the present enforcement environment, which is sort of the quintessential one-way ratchet, right? It only gets worse and penalties only get bigger. I like to remind them about not just what's going on in the world of FCPA enforcement and trade controls, but in our industry. And for good or for bad, a number of our competitors have had major compliance issues and huge settlements and penalties and so forth. And that always gets their attention as well. And I think they understand the risk that we face. And then I also want to make them understand the importance of how to respond when there is a compliance miss, because any global, heavy infrastructure company is going to have its share of compliance misses. And of course, the key is proper investigation, remediation, and we believe transparency and cooperation with government authorities. And so making sure they understand that when we do have the first sign of a problem, the need to get in there and get under the covers and do a thorough investigation in order to minimize the potential consequences.
And so you've moved to that topic of the discipline remediation. And Lynn, in your notes, you sent actually a fourth bullet of the things that you work on as part of your process on follow-up, discipline remediation, and ongoing assessment.
Yes, I did. So I think one of the things that jumped out at me, at least as I was writing this up, was that in terms of enforcement, we always try to at least be fair, so there's no special treatment for executives. And so I do try to report to the board, but also to those GMs, to those business leaders. Look, I mean, nobody likes to hear about it, right? But when there is an issue with an executive, I put it right there in my statistics. So people, associates all the way, from soup to nuts, everybody knows that we are trying to be fair and transparent about that. Another thing is we try to demonstrate positive changes. Of course, the speak up line is confidential, so we don't then at the conclusion of an investigation make a big announcement about, hey, there was a speak up and it was substantiated, so now we're going to do X, Y, Z. But we may come in with some messaging, right, with some positive messaging and say, hey, we're fixing a procedure, or we're fixing how this worked, and this is going to be better for everybody in X, Y, or Z way. And we want to encourage, obviously, the fact that we want to encourage, speak ups, and we want to encourage reporting to the hotline by showing that it doesn't just get, tossed in the pile and ignored. And then I would say that one of the big things there too, and I think that echoes what Carrie was saying about the DOJ guidance. It's a separate bullet there in the recent guidance, which is that you want to do ongoing testing and monitoring, right? So we want to look at some of these procedures or some of these markets when they're not as under stress, or when it's not because of a big investigation that you've just started. Now, of course, you look at the heat map, right? The Transparency, the Transparency International heat map. There's lots of red, but go to some of those places when it's not because of a case that you're investigating, and say, what's going on? How are you doing? What are your competitors doing? What are you worried about? And of course, there are any number of things that the responses that you'll get. But I do try to balance the reactionary with the proactive.
All right, Jeff, you actually mentioned when we were having our preparation call that when you do investigations, you also have a process where you're looking up the organization, and what allowed that to happen. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, it sort of goes back to the notion that I mentioned earlier about leadership accountability. And I think that when we have investigations of sort of wide-scale failures, obviously you're going to have cases of individual malfeasance and misconduct. But if you've got something broader, then in my experience, it's useful to look not only at the individuals that engaged in the behavior that's under question, but to look at the leadership 2 or 3 levels up and ask the question, what were the leaders doing to create the culture that allowed this misconduct, or in which this misconduct occurred? What did they do to drive a culture? How often did they talk about compliance messaging? Did they support the compliance function? Was it resourced? And what messages and what signals did they send? And in my experience, there's no better way to create the right culture than to hold leaders ultimately accountable, not for particular failings, but for failing to set the right culture. Again, I hate to keep going back to GE, but I learned so much about compliance from my years there. And at GE, they had a major scandal. I can talk about it because it's been on the news, but it was with the Tokyo Electric Power Company, one of the GE's largest customers. And what came out in an investigation many years ago is that acting sort of at the behest of the customer, GE safety engineers were overlooking cracks in housing in nuclear facilities, and fortunately they weren't sort of mission critical or safety critical, but you can imagine the reaction from the regulators and the public when they learned that our employees were complicit in covering up these cracks. And ultimately, 8 or 10 senior leaders in that organization lost their jobs, not because they were doing anything with respect to those particular inspections and may not even have known specifically what was happening, but because it was determined that they just didn't set the right culture in terms of safety, in terms of compliance, in terms of accuracy of certifications, and so forth. And it was obviously it was a huge issue, but nothing better sets the tone in an organization and the message gets across really clearly and really quickly across a company when leaders are held to account for failures like that.
Good point.
Just to finish up, I mentioned that before I went into the corporate world, I was the Inspector General at the Los Angeles Police Department, and they had major sort of corruption scandals or failings every several years. And in the sort of world of the LAPD, when it came to holding the sergeants and the lieutenants and the captains accountable for the misconduct of the officers on the street, if an investigation revealed that a captain said, for example, well, how could you expect me to know what these individual officers were doing? I had no knowledge. That would be viewed as a basis for saying, okay, you get a pass because there was no proof of direct knowledge or involvement. And I would argue, at least now based on my experience, that that's exactly the opposite message that you want to send, and that you want your managers, mid-level managers, to know exactly what's going on, and you should expect them to be held accountable.
So that's a great segue to the next question I was going to ask the panel, and that is specific to the first and second level managers, right? Because we've talked a lot about the executive team and holding them accountable, but in the end, our culture carriers are the first and second level managers. They are the ones who are on all of our posters, right? Who's our first resource? Managers. What do we do to enable? So you tell G stories, I tell Westinghouse stories, but it was the same thing, right? We took our best engineers and we made them managers, and we expected that they would know how to handle these people issues. Know what to do when an employee raised an issue or a problem. And it's not necessarily the case. And, every chance I get when I do assessments, what are you doing to help resource that group to be the culture carriers, to give them the confidence that they know how to address an issue if an employee brings one to them. So maybe start, Melissa?
So, I'm happy you brought that up, and I'll also point out it's one of the areas where the DOJ's issued some sample questions. We had started really working on tone in the middle. So we talk a lot about tone at the top. We talk a lot about individual contributors, right? Training them, holding them accountable. But what are we doing at tone in the middle? So we have started this idea of modeling the best behavior. So we could have beautiful policies from the compliance office and have the most excellent training, but if that individual's people manager or supervisor is not modeling the right behavior, everything's out the window. So, the quote that we use is, your employees will follow your example way more often than they'll ever follow your advice. So you have to be setting the right example for your team. You have to own the behavior of your team. They're going to follow your example. We have, in the vein of leveraging existing company processes, we have a HR process that goes out to all people managers twice a month. It's an email blast that links you to this employee resource, manager resource center. And we have now bought some space into that area. Not every time, but we have co-opted some space there where we can communicate on integrity. So giving them ideas on how to talk to your team about integrity. Hey, annual ethics training is coming up. Here's what you need to know. This scandal has happened. Does it apply to you, or could it happen here? Whatever the issue is, it's part of. It didn't cost us a thing other than the time and energy to come up with topics to push out. But we're trying to get some space to impact people managers in the right way, and to really remind them that they own the integrity of their team, and it's that whole ownership piece that we want them to appreciate.
Does anybody do anything to assist managers when it comes to the issues of perverse incentives, right? We've talked, there's been a lot of headlines in the news about an organization that really had some perverse and inappropriate incentives that drove some bad behavior and really puts those managers in a very challenging spot. Does anybody on the panel or in the audience engage directly with the board on setting of the targets for the incentive program?
We at Rockwell Automation, we've evaluated ours in the sales organization after the Wells Fargo story, just to make sure that we weren't putting the levers in the wrong places. So we did that ourselves, so that when and if the question's asked, we have the answer.
We did a couple of things just specific to trade loading or channel stuffing, which is that Joanne Temel was there in the corner. She's our training director, but we did a trade loading course between Q2 and Q3 last year, which was just a module, I think 10 minutes, Joanne, but it went out to several thousands of folks, and that was well received. And then I do know that Control actually does a check themselves at the end of every quarter. That's just built in. So on that particular area of concern, that's sort of just already built into the system that they're looking at that. And we of course then through our speak ups and look at whatever cases may also be alleged in that category.
Anything? Yes.
I'm so sorry. I'm so glad you brought up this question, and I was just hoping we could add to it with goal setting, because compensation is one issue, but target setting is the other. And are they bringing the ethics folks involved when they're setting the actual targets between what's achievable and what's going to cause people to cut corners?
That's a great question. Is anybody here in the audience involved in the objective setting, having those conversations with their board leadership? Can you say a few words?
Sure. Can't obviously provide confidential information.
Absolutely, please don't.
Generally speaking, first of all, I think this issue probably exists in every company in one form or another, but it's a question of degree. So when you're setting numeric targets for bonus achievement, for example, so I am in the position where I can see how those are set across the entire enterprise and have some say in it. And so I have just gotten to the stage now where whenever I see it in the formative stage, the developing a target that is going to create a conflict of interest for a group of employees or an individual employee to choose between acting in the best interest of the company and acting in their own personal financial interest. I raise my hand right away. This is go first with management, and usually that you can talk it through. But if that doesn't produce an acceptable outcome, then you have to be willing in these roles as chief compliance and ethics officers to go to the board. And if you decide to, if you you should always do that transparently. You should never like go behind management's back unless there's some super compelling reason to do that. And you had better have a great presentation on the merits. And, because, the true merits, I've always found, will prevail. So, it might be little setbacks here and there, or you might have to get delayed a little bit, but in the long run, the merits of it, should prevail. And the good thing about speaking to the whole board about it is now you have a group of people. So it's not just a single management person. And so one of the pieces of advice I always give to people when they're going into these roles is you obviously have to be very tuned in to management and your reporting chain. But don't put all your marbles into the relationship with management, because management will change over usually at a faster rate than the members of the board. So you need to establish this independent relationship with the directors, and that takes time. That's not something you can just show up at one board meeting and shake hands or go to a dinner. It literally takes, years. But you have to have that in mind. And if you can approach it that way, then when it gets to the point, now you have the credibility. So if you speak up, and because it's an important enough issue, you're going to be listened to, probably more than a lot of the business people.
Yes.
The new ISO standard 37001 also speaks specifically to this in section 7.2.2, and it's one of the requirements that the chief compliance officer conduct this analysis to ensure that the perverse incentives do not exist.
That's really a great point, and I would just add to it that when you do board training, that it's very important to have a conversation with the board. It's a lot easier sometimes. You have to do it when you make, and I think your process is awesome, and the fact that you've got the credibility to do it. And I think the way to start that conversation is to start at board training in the abstract and have them to recognize, think about, when they're setting targets, they're setting the risk. And are they asking the right questions about that? So I know we have 5 minutes left. I did want to mention to come back to the DOJ guidelines and ask our panelists whether or not you think this is going to be a game changer for the potentially more demonstration of ROI.
Well, I think it's always good in terms of talking to the leadership to have the latest pronouncements and remind them that they are looking at the architecture of the compliance program. In terms of the substance, I don't think it's a game changer. I think it restates what we all knew were the questions that would likely be asked if we ever had to find ourselves in that unenviable position of defending our compliance program before the DOJ or the SEC. It's helpful to have them restated. It's helpful to have them in one place. It's a good document. But you mentioned the ISO. There's so many sets of guidelines out there. I think that if I had to look at one, this is the one I'd look at because the DOJ and the SEC are the risks I'm most concerned about. So I don't think it breaks new ground in terms of what it says, but I think it's great to be able to go to the board and say, this is still top of mind at DOJ, and these are the things that we need to do. And as I'm looking to sort of expand our program, for example, into mergers and acquisition due diligence and having a seat at the table when it comes to M&A, it's great to be able to point to this and say, this is what is expected of us. It's not just, building an empire or inserting ourselves where we don't belong. It's trying to meet the best practices and the expectations of a key regulator.
Any other comments?
I agree.
Okay. All right. So there was actually one last story that I wanted to ask, actually Jeff to close with, which was the story of the email that you got, and maybe what you ultimately decided to do with that.
Yeah. So one of my team members forwarded an email to me that there's a regional sales conference. And we asked to insert 5 or 10 minutes of talking points in the leader's sort of keynote speech about the importance of ethics and compliance. And the response that came back from the people that were putting the whole event together was, oh no, we don't, compliance has nothing to do with this gathering. This is all about sales and growth. And the last thing we want to do is have people be thinking about compliance. And so my reaction, as you can imagine, was pretty negative. And then what I think was even worse is that when people on my team told me that they were surprised by my surprise, because that's what they're facing all the time. And so I actually don't know how I'm going to handle that, but I have my periodic briefing coming up with the leadership team, and I was thinking about maybe sanitizing that email and sort of putting it up and talking about tone at the top and tone at the middle, and that I really need and rely on their buy-in and their support in order to do the job that they expect of us.
Yeah, you'd be tempted to make a poster or a T-shirt with, right, and show up at the conference with. But,
I'll get back to you next. I'll get back to you next week. I'll let you know.
Right.
All right. So I know that this is a tricky subject. We obviously don't have all the answers here. It's something we've all talked about. I've been talking about it for 25 years. You know, how do we justify our existence or whatever? I do think the fact that we're talking more about being a strategic partner and more about risk management and less about compliance, that really is, I think, the way to position the message. And we just, keep adding value where we can. And, I always said in my Westinghouse program, we had one call every year that paid for the cost of the program, and everything else was gravy. So, whatever it takes. But I really encourage, the board engagement is incredibly important. The middle management, first level management, very important. And the fact that, we do not own compliance. The business leaders own compliance. And I think we had a lot of good discussion today from the panel, and I want to thank each of them for their great thoughts and for you all to being here.